Hello and welcome. My name is Trismegistus, and today we're going to be playing Asteroids, I guess? Friday Facts 411. All About Asteroids. Posted by Fergal and Erendel. Hello! Welcome to Fergal's Factorio Friday Facts. FFF, if you will. Over the last few months, you have seen asteroids a few times as a background part of some other Friday Facts. But for all their understated majesty, they were actually quite a complicated trick to pull off. Come with me as I take you on a 3,720 to 1 journey through this asteroid field. It's a bit of a techie one this week, so if that's not your cup of tea, then let's try some of this engagement stuff. Let me know when you think we will find out about the next planet, what it's called, and what the theme will be. Asteroids do concern me. We first started with placeholder asteroids that were just the same as any other sprite, a 2D pre-rendered image with lights and shadows as part of it. This worked, but it looked pretty weird that the asteroids were all oriented the same direction and only moved in the XY plane without rotating. And this is the video of that. It just says on the caption, early placeholder asteroids by V. So I think you can see these are essentially the same model, the same sprite basically, the same picture, and they've just been resized slightly in cases, so you see sort of medium-sized ones, big-sized ones, and you've got this sort of whitish one, sort of blue and orange one, and this sort of, what would you call that, black and yellow one, I guess, maybe green. And they say they're just bigger and smaller, and as he points out, they're not rotating, so they do look very weird. You would, you'd kind of, all the tropes and everything we've seen in space, you would expect the asteroids to be rotating slowly, but they're not. So rotation is something we were talking about going into the asteroid design process. I'm not someone with a lot of experience with like creating graphics, etc., but when it says 2D pre-rendered image, that's, as it says, how they do the graphics in Factorio generally. And what that means is they are actually designed and built in 3D applications like Blender and stuff like that. I'm not actually sure what program they use. I think it is Blender, but they are actually 3D models when they make them like that. They just then output a series of static images that essentially can then be joined together in order to form the animation of the sprite. That's pretty much how all sprite-based games are, other than when someone actually draws the sprite rather than sort of 3D rendering it. One of the big advantages is performance basically, and the simplicity of implementing it, because if you're just showing, if you're showing a series of static images in a row, it's very different to an actual model that has to be animated live in the game. So, it is a lot simpler. Also in Factorio, we don't have any kind of map rotation or orientation rotation. So you're always looking at the scene in exactly the same way. And of course that has the advantage that it's nice and simple. Then you only have to render out a certain viewpoint, and you only have to design the building, the object, the tree, the grass, what have you, to be looked at from a certain direction. Asteroid Designs by Erendel. When we settled on 3 different asteroid types, we could start on the real asteroid designs. Given the setting, it was clear that the asteroids would need to be as visually distinct from each other as possible. By setting, I assume they mean space, not like the whole game setting. So if you're having to show all of your asteroids on a single, essentially black, maybe with bits of dust on it, but essentially black screen, they need to be very visually different is the point, because if they're too close, you can't really tell them apart, and of course they may be whizzing down the screen because you could be travelling quite fast. We could have used the same conventional asteroid shape for all the asteroid types and only used colour to differentiate them, like with the placeholders. That would require them to be more vibrant than we wanted them to be, but the main problem is that it just wouldn't look as good overall. So that's referring back to this initial version, where all they're doing is they're recolouring them. I think they have changed the orientation of, for the different asteroids, although they aren't rotating or anything like that. But these essentially are just recoloured. So one's white, one's black and yellow, and one's orange and blue. And so the idea is to introduce some shape element to the difference as well, so that they become even more visually distinct. Also, variety is more interesting, and therefore it would look better overall. Instead, we decided to design asteroids to be different in every aspect. We know there are going to be 3 types of asteroid in the game. There's the metallic ones, the carbon ones, and the oxide ones, as it shows here. I think we've been introduced to them in a slightly different naming convention. I think we have known metallic, and I can't remember if it was carbon that was specifically used, but I don't think oxide was used. I think that was water. So it's interesting that it is being called oxide, because we know that the way that we fuel our thrusters on our platforms will use oxidizer. So they were clearly thinking along those lines quite early on, that you would have an oxidizer that you would use to create the fuel to use your thrusters on your platform. And I think we can see these are very visually different. We've got the sort of circular one, if you see what I mean, sort of curved, which is fairly plain if I'm honest, but that's good because it contrasts with the other two designs. We've got this metallic one. I would say this is probably more what I would expect an asteroid to look like, because it's clumps of, well, very loose clumps of rocks, stuck together. So it's going to have jaggly, gnarly type shape, and that's perhaps how you would traditionally see asteroids depicted in film and what have you. We've then got this one that clearly looks like some sort of crystal, so it looks like some sort of crystalline formation. Perhaps a geode, if you've ever seen a sort of broken open geode, it looks like that type of large crystal formation. First, the overall shape. This is important because of the lighting on the asteroids. A large part of identifying them is the shape of their left illuminated side. Metallic asteroids would be heavily deformed concave shapes of pitted metal. Carbonic asteroids would be convex masses of gravel and dust, a bit more like merged spheres that had been blended together. Oxide asteroids would be hard faceted shapes with more straight lines and sharp angles. For the materials, the metallic asteroids would have a metallic sheen. Carbonic asteroids would be very rough with more gravel-like surface imperfections. Oxide asteroids would be more shiny and glass-like, but less like a clean gemstone and more of a battered, dusty or frosty look. With these things, we could have some nice-looking and distinct asteroids, but it made another problem worse. The asteroids being very distinct also made it very recognisable when any of them repeated. To avoid noticeable repetitions, we'd need loads of variation, and because the sprites are quite large, doing so would be very costly. Another option is to hide some of the similarity by making the asteroids rotate, but 7,680 reasons to not rotate, by Fergal. There's quite a strong Millennium Falcon in the asteroid feel to this one, isn't there? Usually for sprites that need to rotate, such as the character or vehicles, we render a separate image for every rotation so the lighting matches up. While this approach would likely still have worked for this case, it would have been a performance nightmare, with each asteroid having 5 sizes, each of which would need some amount of variation, and probably at least 64 frames to convincingly rotate. We would have needed a whopping 7,680 frames of animation. Clearly a different solution was needed. The pre-rendering thing is, I say, because they are 3D modelled, what you then do is you then put the lighting on them and you render out the image as is. So effectively it flattens down shadows. So with a proper 3D object in a proper 3D game, it will simulate the lighting, the shadows dynamically, although there are a heck of a lot of shortcuts. But it will basically dynamically simulate them, so you don't have to pre-render out the image hundreds and thousands of times. When it is a sprite, if it's something that's rotating, and you've got to remember it can only rotate a little bit for each version of that sprite, because otherwise you will notice it jankily flipping between the images. So you need enough to make a smooth rotation. And of course it's got to rotate right the way around through 360 degrees. You then just multiply that up. So if you want different sizes of asteroids, then you add in another multiplication. If you want perhaps colour variations maybe, then you add in more multiplications. If you want textural, structural, slight differences, because of this point that if you just repeat them all the time, then they're obvious. If you get all those multiplied together, then you end up with thousands of frames of animation. Now you might say, so what? They're just frames of animation. You've got to remember what they're going for is lots and lots of asteroids on the screen at the same time. So that means that basically every single frame of animation needs to be loaded into memory, because otherwise you're limiting yourself. You could use RNG, random number generation, to pick which asteroid you're going to spawn, and of course then you've got all of the frames of animation for that asteroid as well. So it's probably more efficient from a rendering point of view to have all of the sprites just available, otherwise you're constantly swapping them in and out of memory. But that means you've got to have a lot of sprites cached in memory, and your platform, of course, could be quite huge, and you've got all sorts of other effects they probably want to apply. So there's a lot going on there, and that's where you get into the performance problems. So it's the sort of flip side in a sense of being a 2D game, because every sprite needs lots of variations if you're going to do something as complicated as rotating them. Enter shaders. It seemed clear that we would need some method of dynamically applying lighting information to an asteroid. This is where the game artist's best friend, the normal map, comes in. For those not in the know, a normal map is an image which essentially stores the slope of what it is representing. This Friday Facts has some of these slidey diagrams that I love so much. So on the left here, I believe this is the normal map applied to the object. So if you imagine that the object itself is basically just an outline like we saw before, so like this, it'll be just an outline of some description. Then what they're doing with the normal map is they're applying it as a kind of adjustment to that surface. So what it essentially allows you to do, a normal map, is simulate shadows. So you would render this out, it would be done in a 3D environment. These would be 3D objects somewhere along the line. But then you basically say to the game, right, well, give me some numbers, essentially, that tell me whether it's sloped at a particular, shallow angle or a deep angle, whether it's sloping up and down or whether it's sloping left and right. Those are the types of things that's stored in a normal map. And what you do, and this is what this is showing here, is you basically use the color channels, red, green, blue, and it can be done in various different ways, but essentially you use the different color channels to convey that information. Now when you look at them, of course you see like green dominant in places and red dominant in places and that sort of thing. But in reality there's probably red underneath that you kind of can't see. And essentially if you look at it from a point of view of it's effectively 3 images that have been superimposed on top of each other, then you can kind of understand how the information is being used. One of the things that is a kind of parallel to it, and it's kind of, people don't, I'm guessing older viewers will be familiar with this, and not so much, younger viewers, but basically you used to have 3D glasses, which were, one side would be red and one side would be blue or green, and it would filter out that particular light wave of light. And so what they would do to create the 3D image is they would project an image that had both red and green offset. And so when you combine them together via your, it would filter out, and one eye would see one and one eye would see the other, and so your brain then sees a stereoscopic image. It's seeing 2 slightly different perspectives, and it combines them together to form a 3D object. I mean, that's essentially how your vision works anyway. And so this is the same type of trick, essentially. You're saying, right, well, we'll use red channel information to convey this type of information, and we'll convey green channel information to convey this type of information. In this case, left-right slope is red, the red channel, and top-bottom slope is the green channel. And so you can imagine if you take those in isolation, that allows you then to adjust the shadow, adjust the lighting in order to create that particular effect, because your brain will fill in. It's kind of one of these things that it's an optical illusion, essentially, that you know to interpret something that's dark to mean that it's going into shadow, essentially, and something that's light to be that light is falling on it. So if you just have something that is light and dark, then it looks like it's a textured surface. It isn't, it's just white and black, but it gives that illusion to you, basically. I'm explaining that in a lot of detail because, I say, this is a techie one. If that's not your cup of tea, there's a lot more of that coming, so yeah, just to warn you. In order to apply this slope information to apply lighting, we need to do some clever maths on it in a shader to reference the slope direction from a fixed point of light. So interestingly, this is kind of getting into doing a type of 3D, and it's basically a shader is, as it says, it applies a shade to an object. So if you've got a picture and you want to cause certain parts of it to come out in relief and look like it's shadowed, then you apply a shader over the top and it darkens certain parts and lightens certain parts to give that 3D effect. And so we see in this video the end result. lighting updating with rotation, the caption says. And as you can see, the asteroids are rotating round and the shadows are moving appropriately. Okay, so there's one here, I think, that has probably the best example of the shadows changing. So as it rotates round, it's sort of moving sufficiently fast enough. You see that comes into light? And that's the normal map changing, basically. So what they're storing is a normal map, which is a lot less data for each asteroid. And that normal map provides it with the information to apply this shader rather than storing out every single different variation. And what you've got to remember is that by having a shortcut for shadows, you can then have a shortcut as well for colouring, so that this asteroid here can be, slightly yellow, slightly pink, slightly green, slightly orange. You can do anything with it, including varying speckles on it and patterns, and you can do that across lots of different asteroids. So you can have a sort of single speckle pattern, and then you just conform. I'm sort of preempting some of the things I'm talking about, conforming it to that thing. So instead of having to, essentially you're taking that maths where it goes, well, we need 3 variants of that, and 2 variants of that, and 4 variants of that, and so you need to render out 3 times 2 times 4. Instead, you store the information that is the variation, and you store the variation that is, and you store the information for the variation, and you store the information for the variation, and then the game can do that combination, and it can pick out randomized sets of those to give you that variation. And of course, then you just have to store those 3 in memory, and it uses them more dynamically. So you're making use of the rendering side of the graphics card rather than storing it in memory, basically. I hope I'm explaining that okay. It's it's not my cup of tea, a bit like the sound stuff. This gives us the diffuse lighting, but there is no colour information. As we don't want to create a 50s style space opera, we need our asteroids to not be black and white. So when rendering them, we need to separate out the colour information from the lighting information. We can blend the generated lighting from the normal map onto our raw colour image, and it gives us a goodish result. So another sliding diagram again. On the left here we've got diffuse colour, and on the right we've got diffuse colour with applied lighting. So yes, this left image is the sort of original in a sense. It's just the colours. It is the colours applied to the object itself, which is why it's got structure to it. So the object itself does have kind of shadow, and the idea is you then come along with the normal map side of thing, and you change that lighting based on the orientation of the asteroid. So this one, for example, on the left here, you can see this is really dark with the lighting in this orientation, but the original isn't really dark in that area. And so you can imagine if it was completely rotated 180 degrees, then that would actually be light because it's being hit by the sun, for example. So yeah, so you can see that these are quite effective, I think, as asteroids. You can kind of tell there are scraggly shapes and spiky shapes and sort of curvy shapes and that sort of thing, and they have different colour themes to them, and that all sort of works. When you apply the lighting, although I would be honest, it is a bit harsh in this initial one here, but when you apply the lighting, they suddenly look like proper 3D objects, and that's what they're doing. And as I say, the advantage is you're not storing every single iteration of these. You can apply that lighting effect to an asteroid that was slightly different colour. So you could have 3 different colours, slightly different colouring, slightly different texturing of the colour, and then you just apply the same shadow set to every single one, you see. However, you will notice a few things. The lighting is very flat, the metal of the metallic asteroids and the shininess of the ice don't come through. This is because the shader isn't accounting for the shininess of the materials yet. But we don't want a uniform increase in shininess, it should be different in different areas. So we'll render out another pass, this time for the specular lighting. This is starting to feel like I'm doing a Digital Foundry explainer, because they're always banging on about things like normal maps and specular lighting and all that sort of stuff. Specular lighting is basically the highlights, like the extreme highlights. So if a image has a light shining on it, then if it is sufficiently shiny, and depending on its shininess, you will get a different intensity to the spot of light that will be the shine point for that object. That's as simple as I can kind of explain it. It's basically the extreme reflection point. We apply this simply by using the diffuse colour to handle the reflection colour and make the asteroids brighter in the right areas. So again, slidey diagram. On the left, we've got specular only. And right, we've got specular with previous steps. So these are where the extreme highlights are. Okay. And it's using the original color map in order to do that. So it's using this image here. Yeah. So where it's got like this bit is slightly shadowy compared to that bit. It's saying that's where I want lots of specular highlights. That's where it's going to be shiny. It's extreme, basically, and that's what you'd say. It's like the most, if you imagine the most harshest light, really intense light, that's what the specular reflection is capturing. And of course, you don't want that to be that extreme either, so you blend it in with all the other things that you're doing. So we're now getting these super highlights on little bits of the asteroid. Yeah, so if this was just some dull rock, that'd be fine, but they want it to look metallic, and metallic means shiny, so now we get this specular effect applied, where the really, really shiny points that just happen to be facing your direction become light and bright. And of course it doesn't just apply, we know that this is a lump of carbon, lump of coal effectively, lump of graphite, so you would think it might not have as many specular reflections, and it's certainly not as intense. But of course, even a black material like carbon will have like a reflectivity when extreme light is shown on it. And of course, you're going to get the water ice asteroids somewhere in between, where they've got very, very shiny surfaces, but only when it's like jaggedly pointing towards you. So where you might expect the more blobby type metallic asteroids to do, a more sphere-like reflection style. The spiky asteroids, so these water ones, there's going to be one surface that's suddenly really, really bright, and then it moves out and it stops shining at you. So that's how you convey the shininess, basically, and they can work that out using the color map. But the ice still looks wrong. It is too solid. Ice allows some light to pass through it and scatter, giving it that beautiful blue glow. This is known as subsurface scattering, or SSS. So, one more image and render pass for those, blended only in the areas where lighting is indirectly hitting. So, not sure I need to explain that one. That's a pretty good explanation of it. Basically, some types of material let light into them and out again, and depending on how opaque it is, so how see-through it is, it'll either let all the light through, like a piece of glass, and you would just get a sharp reflection on the very surface, and no real reflection from the actual glass itself. I mean, you do, which is why if you open a window, the light will change. But for ice, for water, it lets light quite deep into it and then reflects it. And if you didn't know, water is actually blue. It's very, very, very faintly blue. And the best way to see the blueness of ice, and water, obviously, is in glaciers. So if you've ever seen a glacier, or the icebergs that carve off from the poles, those will look very blue because the water is sort of, in a solid form, and therefore is slightly more reflective in the right way. So people think that that's why water is blue, but it isn't. It's because it's actually, water is blue, basically. There is also a bit too much shadow on all the asteroids, however. While this is technically accurate, since there is nothing to bounce light around in space, it looks unnatural to our Earth-evolved eyes. So we can drop the intensity of the shadow down and add a secondary light source at a complementary angle to the first. So yeah, in space, light is really harsh. You get really diffuse light on Earth, on the surface of planet Earth. But when you're looking at it, you're not thinking realistic, you're thinking what I've seen and experienced in my life. So they're basically softening the light a bit and adding more of these diffuse reflections. So, light hits a bit of material there and reflects that way and illuminates something that's otherwise in shadow over here. So you get a sort of a diffusion of the light, basically. So that's what they're saying is kind of missing as well from this image. So on the left here, we've got the no subsurface scattering or bounce light. And on the right, we've got the surface scattering and bounce light applied. Possibly the easiest one to notice what's changing is this one here, because of course this is one of the water asteroids, so it's going to have more of that diffusion effect. But as you can see, this is the original, and then as you go here, you see how you get a sort of not shadowing, I guess, is it? It's a subsurface scattering effect. So light is being mimicked as passing through the edge of this lump of ice, And so you can actually see the blueness as the light passes through that edge. And then you don't see it there because they're not simulating. It's got a little bit because you do get a halo effect no matter what. But even this tiny, subtle little change makes it look a bit more like an actual lump of ice rather than a lump of stone or something like that. And of course you get less of that effect on the more metallic and carbonic asteroids, and then much higher level of that effect on the water asteroids. And we are done. Thank you to Erendel and Priscilla for helping figure out some issues with the lighting calculations. And this is the final result. I mean, and it does look really good, doesn't it? I mean, it's sort of a lot more, should we say, dynamic in terms of how it looks than a lot of the objects on the planets, as you'd kind of expect, because it's a rotating lump of something. I think you can clearly see the themes as well, so the blue ones for the water, the spiky metally ones for the metallic, and the blobby ones for the carbon. I think that is quite clear. Even quite small chunks have distinct style to them. One of the things I would say is this does explain why we've sort of seen a lot of variation on the images when they've been doing platforms. Initially, of course, I was drawing the conclusion that maybe there were lots of different asteroids, but it sounds like it probably isn't. It's just lots of variation in the images. It does leave the question of how they're representing it in terms of icons. So when you've grabbed the chunks of asteroid, are we just getting, 3 icons basically, or are we getting multiple variations of asteroids? Because we do appear to have seen sort of more than 3, I think. But yeah, I really like it. It looks really good. I would just say, I mean, there is a sort of aliasing effect on it, though. I don't know if that's just because of the video or what have you. Aliasing is where you get like the jagged edges to it. I'm pretty certain when you're flying about in your platform or something like that, it's just not going to be noticeable at all. It's only because we're sitting in an asteroid field with loads of them floating about that that's apparent. So I'm sure that's not going to be a problem. Space Dust Shader by Fergal. While Jersey's Starfield shader and the motion of the asteroids went some way towards showing the player the platform was moving, the effect was, overall, difficult to see. We needed something obvious and everywhere, but not over the top. One solution would have been the classic warp speed effect of the likes of Star Trek or Doctor Who, but this felt a little cartoony and slightly divorced from the pseudo-realistic style of Factorio. So I settled instead on a compromise of some motion-blurred micrometeorites and interplanetary dust, presumably from all the exploded asteroids. I'm guessing that's a reference to the fact that we're moseying around the solar system and crushing and destroying things as well. And the caption here just says space dust going by, and you can just see that sort of floating in. I haven't actually read this bit yet. I'm wondering if this is maybe done with a bit of parallaxing. Parallaxing is the effect where, or it's a technique that you use to give the effect of, if you've ever travelled in a train in particular, you can see it in cars as well, but trains really good, where you see sort of trees that are in the near distance, right next to you, zipping past, and then, fields maybe further away, trees are moving at a medium sort of a speed, and then stuff far away is only gently creeping along. And so if you have like different layers essentially and just zip them past at different speeds, you get a parallax effect where it looks like you are moving against a background basically. It was a very, very common technique when I started gaming, when I was a kid, and we used to have Amigas and things like that. And a lot of games would use parallax to show your characters moving as you would walk across, they'd be platform games or side-scrollers, and you would walk along and the parallax effect would show you the background moving in a sort of realistic depth way, basically. I don't know that they're going to use that. I'm just wondering because I haven't read past this point because I didn't get the chance. One of the things I would say about this is I assume this is effectively, it's not going to be like this, I don't think, in the game, unless we are getting a proper asteroid field, as I've been speculating, an actual asteroid belt where there's loads and loads of asteroids. My understanding is it's more like random asteroids as you're going through. It's a lot more sparse, a lot more distributed, few of the massive ones, that sort of thing. Just very occasional hazards as you go between planets. One method to create this effect would have been spawning huge amounts of smoke and particles with some motion blur. However, particles take quite a lot of resources in large numbers, and since this effect needs to scale with whatever size platform you are viewing, this would result in an exponential increase in cost. So particles literally means just little dots, basically, particles. And one of the things that's actually quite sort of heavily used in a lot of games that kind of gives it a lot of polish is particle effects. So when you, particularly like JRPGs are very, very, they use this a lot. And you'll have a slash animation to a sword and an attack, and essentially they're all just particle effects where it's just like a collection of particles where it's got some physics going on in how the particles work, and it then gives a spectacular spray of colour and effects. And essentially those are just particle effects. They're just bits, as it were, that are being, as I say, swished across in a particular pattern or according to a certain physics engine or what have you, to give that visual pop and flair. But the basic point they're making is if this is something that's flashing past the screen, that's a lot of resources to put into what is meant to just be atmosphere, basically. Not literal atmosphere, but to give atmosphere. Instead, I opted to create a single texture with all of the particles on it. In an effort to further optimize, this texture is then packed with several other textures used in the shader. This keeps the sampler count low while still allowing for lots of detail. So these are the 4 images, or I think that's actually 5, 5 images. Oh yes, because that's the combined one at the end, basically. So we will actually, I'm going to pop these out because they are actually a lot bigger, and you can kind of compare them a bit better. But you've also got these dashed lines, you've got the star field, you've got the motion of the star field, and then motion blur type of thing, and then you've got the actual dust particles. So if we go through those, so first off you've got these big lines, basically. Again, sort of big movement, basically. You've then got the star field, and then you've got the motion to the star field. If I flick between those two, you should be able to see that they are aligned. So this is the motion of the stars, basically. And then the next one is the dust pattern. And that's sort of just a speckly noise effect, basically. Now, when you combine them all together, you get this, basically. Now, what you might be thinking is, where are the big lines? I don't really know, if I'm totally honest. It sort of seems to disappear. And then the caption just says on the last one, all 4 images combined into one RGBA image. So RGBA is red, green, blue, alpha. Alpha is transparency, basically. So it's how opaque, how transparent that particular pixel is. So if you imagine RGB, red, green, blue, is the pixel colours in your monitor. So it's saying how much red's in that green, blue, how bright each of those goes. But then alpha allows you to adjust the transparency of it on top of that. So it's like an extra subtle tweaking knob, basically. With a little math on the texture coordinates, we can make this image move, and by masking out the red, green, blue and alpha channels, we can access the pack data that we need. And it just says on the caption for this, simply panning all the textures. So literally just having them roll down. And as I say, we're getting a parallax effect going on. Whether that's how they're doing it or not, I don't know. But basically the star field in the background is moving a lot slower than the sort of bits that are flowing down. However, the dust is all still moving at more or less the same rate, which looks weird. So we will make the specks and dust move at different rates by simply modifying the speed in the panner function. But we also don't want all the specks to move at the same speed. It would look too much like a single cohesive structure. This is where some of the masking textures come in. We can use image 1 to selectively mask out individual particles at different times, which helps you sell the illusion of many small things moving independently. This is done with a bit of maths to graph a peak around a value. We'll then assign the target value to a time variable and loop it back around. So what this is doing, this dashed one, is essentially it's acting like a switch, to be very crude about it, for the other stuff. So by varying this up and down, essentially, taking the bits and turning them off and turning them on, you can then use that to mask out, to hide some of the particles behind it. So in other words, they're going to flick in and out of being visible as this applies an effect to it. That's fascinating. Random selection of which speck to show. So it's like a filter, that's being applied on top of it as well. It's interesting. Currently, the particles are using the trail image at 100% all the time. So I guess where I was thinking this was a star field, these are actually the particles. So this one here, those aren't stars, those are particles, and then these are the trails for the particles. because we've got the space in the background basically, and then it's particles that are being applied on top. Currently, the particles are using the trail image at 100% all the time, but they should be less blurred if they are moving slowly. Thanks to some pre-planning when creating the image, we can do this by cutting out pixels below a threshold. Since the trail image is a linear gradient, this means we can control the length pretty easily. We just subtract the target value from the image value. So basically what they're doing there, the actual trail image, so let's have a look at that one. This one here, if you notice, it's very bright at the like the tip of the trail, and then it sort of darkens down, so it becomes more grey, essentially. So what they can do is they can use a threshold to say, right, well, if you're moving slowly, you're not going to see this big trail. So we use a threshold to cut off all of the pixels, all of the bits of white that are below a certain value, certain grey in a grayscale, and say, right, anything below that, we don't show. And so the higher up that cutoff point is, the more of the trail is shown. So as the platform speeds up, they must set that lower and lower and lower, as it's accelerating, so that more and more of the trail becomes visible. So effectively, where you're thinking, you're seeing the trail extending out, what you're actually seeing is it's more like if you think 3D terms, if the trail is some shape like that, then as you move a line up and down it, you see more or less of it. So if it's right the way at the bottom, you see all of the tail. If it moves up, you just see the very tip of the tail. And so you can tie that to the speed of the platform. So as it reaches maximum speed, it probably reaches that maximum trail before it reaches maximum speed, I imagine. But basically, once you reach that maximum point, you see all of it. And as you slow down, that line moves up and you see less of the trail. That's fascinating. So everything moving, as it increases speed, it shows more and more of the trail. I presume they do also change the speed of the particles. I didn't say that yet, but one would assume they're going to change that as well. If we repeat the process a couple of times at different speeds and scales, we create a forced parallax effect. There you go. I.e., dust closer to the camera is larger and moves more quickly. Now, all we need to do is combine it all together and tie the intensity to the zoom level so it's not too distracting when building, and we are done. Okay, so intensity just means, like how bright it is. So as you zoom in and out, this effect is going to become more or less stronger. So if you zoomed right in, presumably it's less intense. Would have been useful to see a comparison basically, but I would assume if you zoomed right out, then it's more apparent, more there, so that you can kind of get more of the atmosphere, because at that sort of scale you probably wouldn't be building a great deal other than using maybe blueprints. And it's only when you're zoomed in do you need to be able to see, right, I need to place this inserter here, exactly here, and this wall here, and that sort of thing. So you want that effect to go away a bit, because otherwise it'd get in the way. Now here we see this all brought together. This is space dust over a moving platform. The platform in question is very Borg cube-like. It has a lot of walls on it. I think this is just for decoration, really. I can't see what purpose there would be in sticking walls around these turrets, really. One thing we do see, though, is that this is using quality level 5, legendary quality, uranium ammunition. I mean, that's got to be staggeringly expensive, hasn't it? Because you're having to go right up the chain and you're losing so much uranium. The amount of coverts you have to be running to do that. Now, what is interesting about that, though, I would say, and I don't think there are too many Easter eggs in this post, because it's one of the techie ones, and I guess they don't tend to do that, but are these being made on this platform? Or have they just stuck them in just to show us them? Because if this is running some kind of legendary uranium ammo production facility on this platform, that's kind of nuts, isn't it? Because there's loads of it, and there's loads and loads on that belt, and they'll have 6 they store in each? I can't remember, 5 or 6, maybe 10. I can never remember how much they stick in there in each one, but there's loads of that stuff. I'm also assuming the whole platform is, the whole video is sped up. Because a bit like the other week, these inserters are just going absolutely mental. I mean, that is so quick. But in this case, it does look like the belt is like skipping essentially along. So I think it is probably a sped up image. And this platform is probably just trickling along very slowly maybe. But yeah, the main point of it really is that these things are passing along and we're getting the odd flick of dust coming through and clouds of dust and all these sorts of effects, and they're using this, fading them in and fading them out and showing different pieces in order to give that parallax effect I was talking about. Done with the foreground element anyway. While the dust helps tell the story of movement, the space still feels very 2D. Why are all the asteroids perfectly planar with our platform? Planar meaning in the same plane, so they're all basically sat at the same level of the platform, which, if you think about it, is weird. Going through an asteroid field, it's not all going to be perfectly everything in a plain line, basically. So we need some background elements, more asteroids. Again, we could have just created more asteroids that render behind the platform and don't collide, but this seems suboptimal. Instead, I used a technique called texture splatting to create infinite amounts of asteroids from a single texture atlas containing only a few images. This FFF is already quite long, so I won't go into details, but the function basically splits the screen into a grid and aims to place one asteroid in each with a random offset. For those interested in the technique, Daniel Elliott created a fantastically in-depth YouTube series on its implementation, which is almost the exact implementation used here. And this image just is a collection of asteroids, and it says texture atlas of all the background asteroids. So I guess these are special versions of the asteroids that will spawn in the background rather than in the foreground. The shader splits this image into single asteroids by modifying the UV coordinate of the texture sample. If we create a grid of randomized UVs, we can place these asteroids within them. However, if an asteroid is placed across the boundary of two cells in the grid, it will be cut off. So we needed to reference neighbouring cells to find out if they are overlapping the current cell. Thankfully, this can be managed by simply using the same function, plus or minus 1, in any given direction. The caption on this just says, here you can see the grid of cells we generate, as well as overlapping samples, coloured red. I'll be honest, this bit's not quite making sense to me. I'm sure if you go and watch that YouTube series, then it kind of will, but this bit's sort of skipped past a level of my understanding. We give each asteroid a random speed of rotation, motion and scale, and do the whole thing again at a different scale for parallax. We'll then do the same and use the same calculations for dynamic lighting as before, and we have infinite fields of asteroids. That bit I get. They basically do it at different levels to give you that parallax effect. And they do all the lighting, rendering and all that sort of stuff in order to make them sort of 3D. The caption just says, on forever, and this platform is clearly sort of hitting an asteroid field, decelerating and then accelerating again. So we see it moving at a fairly constant speed, and then it slows down, and then it speeds up as it kind of accelerates and decelerates through the asteroid field. I would guess these very black ones in the distance are like one of the lowest levels of the parallax, which is why they are moving at a different, rate compared to the ones that are closer. Thank you very much for coming on this long and technical journey with me. It seems our ship has survived intact. As always, never tell me the odds in the usual places. Okay, I guess speculation now then? What is there to speculate about this? I guess reaction is probably more appropriate. I mean, it's incredibly impressive. It's interesting that they've kind of gone for... I mean, I suppose it's an example of the way the problem magnifies up itself, in that if these were all individual sprites with, pre-rendered frames and all that sort of stuff, this sort of image here with loads and loads and loads of them would have thousands and thousands and thousands of sprites being kind of rendered all at the same time and all having to be stored in memory and all this sort of stuff. Whereas if they apply this more dynamic approach where it relights them and does them on the fly, then you can essentially rely on the graphics rendering pipeline, the actual graphics card that you've got, in order to do the maths basically to create these. So rather than just hog memory basically. So yeah, that's kind of what the optimization side of it is, but it allows them to do kind of more clever things without sort of troubling your processor too much basically. I kind of hope that Asteroid, well, as mentioned in lots of Friday Facts and in this one as well, I hope we get an asteroid belt, that there is an actual asteroid belt where there is a purpose for sending a platform out with loads of guns on it. I mean, it doesn't have any grabber arms that we can see on this, but it's out there collecting all the asteroid stuff because maybe there is a unique resource, could well with the carbon that we've seen, and that there is a purpose for asteroids other than simply the things that are between planets that give you fuel in order to travel. I mean, I hope they are that. That's going to be kind of fun, building platforms to do that. But I also hope there is like this purpose of go to this place and it gets lots of asteroids. Now, you could combine the two. You could say, like, if you go on the route between Malvis and Aquilo, you will encounter the mega asteroids that have got some super secret resource in them. But it's a random chance thing, so you just have a platform flying backwards and forwards, and occasionally it hits one and gives you that thing. But I say, I would quite like there to be an asteroid field, and we need to manage that, and perhaps you can set up a platform close to the asteroid field, because one of the things we don't really know is how does the solar system work as a map? Is it just black holes effect? Because we're seeing all this because we can fly space platforms. If they were just literally you clicked a button, off it went, and you never saw it, or it skipped time while you were traveling, and if you're on the platform, then we wouldn't need all this. So we're seeing it because you can fly around in a space platform. But does that mean we're going to get a gigantic space map that says, right, here's Nauvis, and here's Vulcanus, and here's Fulgora? I can't see how that wouldn't be the case. The question then is, why do we need science? I have found something to speculate about. Why do we need science in order to find the different planets? So if you imagine this, as I say, is you traveling. Imagine this is your car. Your space platform is your car, and you go out and you drive around lakes and you find your choke points and you see where all the trees are for absorbing pollution, and you see where the biters are and where your pollution cloud is. That's what the map is for, right? We're going to have to get some equivalent, one would think, for space platforms, because you can get on a space platform and you can fly it by the looks of things. Yeah? That's why it's speeding up and slowing down. That's why all of that stuff matters. Well, I guess obviously it could run out of fuel and that, so maybe it isn't. But I think we're going to be able to fly a space platform, certainly give it a destination on a route, and like trains, you can get a train to stop on the middle of a route, can't you? Or just a random piece of track, just send it anywhere. And I think you'll be able to do the same with platforms, which to me is what you fill in with the science. Effectively, it tells you where in space the planet is, and perhaps that location is randomized, because otherwise you'd just be able to, because the point is, otherwise you'd just be able to fly there. If you know where Vulcanus is because you've played through the game before, you could just get in your space platform and just fly in that direction. So there's got to be some compromise somewhere that it tells us what the route is, or that you maybe can only fly directly on a single path, maybe. But I've mentioned before, if a platform gets stuck because one of these gigantic asteroids wallops it, this whacking great lump comes in and it knackers your engine, and it's only got one engine and it's dead in the water, how do you go and fix that platform? Maybe it's not got spare bits of platform. Maybe it takes so much damage, it runs out of bits of platform and it can't rebuild itself. It can't run its engines. You've got to have some way of getting to platforms, which means they've got to be findable on some kind of map in order for you to go there. Otherwise, how do you get to them? Do you know what I mean? It feels like there's some missing piece of the space puzzle that is what is the map of space? How does that work in the game? Is it just routes? And what you research is the route? That would make a lot of sense. Is the location of the planet randomized? If that was the case, you could just literally fly around until you found it. Or maybe it randomizes it after you've researched it, so it doesn't have a location until you find it. But then if these intermediate planets are meant to be closer than Aquilo, how does it do that? If you've unlocked all of the space around you, how does it work in terms of the interaction of all the asteroids with the space, with your travelling between the planets and locations of the planets and having to research where the planets are? What is it we are actually researching and unlocking with that research to find a planet? And how exactly are we being stopped from just going to Aquilo? Because you saw in the tech tree that you had to do the 3 planets first before you could get there. But again, it's a planet in a solar system. Can't you just fly there? So yeah, that's going to be fascinating. It's not quite the topic of the Friday Facts, but if these gigantic asteroids, these whacking great lumps of stuff are floating about in the void, how do we find them? Because presumably it's going to be worthwhile harvesting them. But yeah, I mean, I found, as I've said before, these techie ones I found absolutely fascinating. It's a while since we've had a really proper techie one, and I do really enjoy them. But if you've not really engaged with that, then I hope I added a bit of context that was trying to explain some of it. Hope you enjoyed today's Friday Facts video and might consider coming back for another one. If you'd like to chat about the latest Factorio Friday Facts, then you can find me live streaming Factorio every weekend over on my Twitch channel at Trismegistus. Thanks for watching. Cheers. All About Hemorrhoids.